So yesterday marked 90 days for me without any caffeine, and if you know me, that's a pretty big accomplishment. Ever since I was a little kid, I've always loved caffeine, whether I knew it or not. I grew up drinking Coke whenever I would go out to dinner with my family or we would go on vacation, and I remember the feeling of always feeling super amped up, super great whenever I had a Coke. And little did I know that caffeine was digging its claws into little kid me. And, the reason I felt so great was because I was getting loads of sugar and caffeine every time I would drink a Coke. And I really didn't realize that until, I was in the eighth grade and I had my first cup of coffee. And I always knew what coffee was from, my parents drinking it and my older brother drinking it. But I never really put two and two together that the reason they loved it so much was because it had caffeine in it. And that was until I had my first cup of coffee. And I remember feeling super amazing, great, a lot like I did when I drank Coke. But I felt clear headed and I was able to get through my middle school classes in the morning without feeling so tired and drained. And that kind of brings me to high school when, I would continue drinking about one cup of coffee per day. So my caffeine intake was pretty normal, but it started to accelerate towards the end of college when I started having to stay up and write essays and grind for classes. And even more so when I joined the company that I work for, a consulting company, after I graduated from college. And once I graduated from college, I lived right across the street from a Starbucks that I would stop at almost every morning. I would get a grande latte, and then I would just savor the walk to work and savor those early morning hours of writing emails and cranking through spreadsheets until inevitably I would have a 2 p.m. crash where I would need a re-up of caffeine. So I would go to the coffee machine that was in my office and I would basically just drink coffee or espresso until I felt good enough again to go about my day and make it to 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. depending on how busy I was that day. And that was kind of the first red flag that I had with my caffeine consumption. And another red flag that I had actually happened was when I had to quit caffeine for 30 days following surgery. And I remember feeling the physical withdrawal symptoms of quitting caffeine, which I didn't really realize that was a thing. I would have headaches, a lack of motivation, a feeling of being awake but still just feeling kind of tired or asleep, feeling like your brain's not working. And it was pretty brutal for the first week or two of quitting caffeine. And those symptoms eventually subsided, but by the time I reached 30 days without caffeine, I was just so ready to go back to my day-to-day of having caffeine every day that I didn't stop and reflect on whether it was beneficial at all to quit drinking coffee entirely. I was just so ready to just go back to drinking coffee normally. And that kind of brings me to when I quit this time. I realized that I was just drinking coffee and not really getting the benefit out of it, and it was becoming more and more of a crutch for me. I would be super busy and I would get up early and I would have to drink 1 or 2 cups of coffee immediately after I got up to even feel normal, to the point where I could, start working. And after that, I would reach the 2 p.m. crash. I would have more cups of coffee. So I would say I was having 3 or 4 cups of coffee a day. And that obviously impacted my sleep, impacted the way I felt on a day-to-day basis. And I wasn't really stopping and thinking about that because I would just be so focused on getting to the next day and getting to my next fix of coffee. And that kind of brings me to 2 years after I originally quit, which was 90 days ago today, and my current quitting experience. So I quit completely cold turkey. I just had 1 cup of coffee in the morning and then I completely stopped and haven't had it since. And I had braced myself a bit for the physical withdrawal impacts of quitting coffee from the first time around. But one thing that I didn't really realize was that there's also emotional and mental withdrawal symptoms that you can experience when quitting caffeine. After dealing with the physical withdrawal symptoms, it was pretty brutal for the first, I would say, 3 weeks. And after I went through the physical withdrawal symptoms and those for the most part were over with, I basically thought that I was in the clear. I thought that from here on out, I'll be just fine without having coffee. I'll be able to get up, go about my day, and there are not going to be any mental or emotional withdrawal symptoms. I'd never heard of that. When I would watch quitting caffeine videos, people would just say, oh, you just got to get through the first 7 days, get through the headaches, drink water, and after that, you'll be all good, no issues at all. But that wasn't exactly my experience. Even after the physical withdrawal symptoms passed, I had these emotional and mental withdrawal symptoms that were pretty brutal, even I would say just as brutal as the physical withdrawal symptoms, even though they weren't, physical pain. I would get super irritable at the smallest things with my work or with my girlfriend. I would not have motivation to do the things that I would previously have no issue doing. I would just feel lethargic and kind of like my brain didn't work properly. And, I thought these were kind of underlying issues that I was masking with caffeine. But the reality was that these were issues that arose from my brain recalibrating from not having a stimulant on board 24/7, and especially from going from drinking the amount of coffee that I was drinking to having 0 cups at all. And it took my brain a while to kind of process that and figure out what to do. But with that said, over the last 90 days, I've had a lot of benefits as well. I feel like I'm slowly starting to get a lot of my previous energy back, and I'm starting to feel a lot better. And there's definitely a freedom, a small freedom that you feel for not having to depend on a substance in the morning every single day to be able to get you up and get you going and get you motivated for what you want to do. And I would say another benefit that I really haven't heard many people talk about in their quitting caffeine videos is the fact that caffeine kind of masks what your true passions are and what you really like to do. And I'll go into this a little more. The benefit that I'm talking about is the fact that you'll start to feel what you like and what you dislike again. And that kind of sounds like maybe it's good and bad, and I would definitely agree with you. Things that you previously found boring will feel boring again, and things that were previously draining will feel draining again. And that's not something I really thought about when I was caffeinated, because when I was drinking coffee, I would just be so focused on getting from one to do to the next to do, crossing things off my list, being productive, being a good worker for my company, where I wouldn't really stop and think, is this something that I really enjoy doing? Is this something that I'm passionate about? Is this something that gives me energy? And that might sound kind of bad if you're, stuck in a job that you don't really like, but I choose to see it as a big benefit because, on the flip side of that, for the things that do give you energy, the things that you are passionate about, you'll start to want to do those things and feel motivated for those things. Whereas if you're caffeinated, you might just go about your status quo and never even question whether you're liking what you're doing or whether you should continue or try to do something else. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I feel like what I just mentioned is actually why caffeine is so mainstream and so popular and, so pushed on the population. When you're drinking coffee, you're, providing value for the business you're working for. You're going to be able to do that 8-hour shift or work 10 hours or 12 hours. Whereas if you're not caffeinated, you might stop and think, is this something that I'm actually getting value out of? Is this something that I want to do? And, sometimes that's not actually what the big businesses and the people in charge want you to think. And not to mention, caffeine is a giant industry, both here in the US and internationally. And, they have the perfect customer where people become dependent on caffeine. People want to get their coffee every morning. It comes in a nice, cute cup. And they come back day after day because if they can't have it that day, or, if they miss a day, they'll start to have physical withdrawal symptoms. And even if they push through those physical withdrawal symptoms, they'll have mental and emotional withdrawal symptoms. And it's not really popular to talk about quitting caffeine. It's not accepted as a drug. In fact, it's a social thing. If you're working a job, you want to go do coffee chats with people senior to you so you can get to know them. And it's kind of ingrained in our culture to be addicted to caffeine, for lack of a better term, so that you can stay up, you can be productive, and you can get that bliss from your morning coffee every day. And I would say when I started looking at caffeine from that perspective, in terms of, maybe it's something that sort of masks your critical thinking and what you really like and dislike, I feel like I haven't really been able to see it the same way. And for that reason, I'm gonna continue not drinking caffeine for the foreseeable future, just because I wanna see, what the future holds for me without caffeine. And I really don't want to go back to that cycle where I'm just doing things just for the sake of it, for being productive. And the feeling of needing a substance or needing something to get up in the morning in order to, be the best version of yourself. I will say I definitely miss having a nice iced latte on a hot summer day, but, I think I can just drink water and be just fine. Don't really need to have that insane stimulant boost, because I know what that cycle leads to, and I'm not really trying to go back there. So if you made it this far in the video, I want to thank you, and I hope you really got some value out of this video that maybe you haven't heard in other quitting caffeine videos. If you like this video, make sure you like it and subscribe to my channel. I'll be trying to post more videos, potentially about caffeine, maybe about other topics. But if you enjoyed this video and thought I provided some value to you, please subscribe and like the video. Thanks, and see you later.